Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Whispers of the Deep. My name is Draken. Today we are going over Chapter 15, Fortuna 4. So, Fortuna 4 is the end of Act 1. It is the end of the Ardonia plotline as we know it. In Lucian 3, we had Lucian leave. In Iroh 4, we have Iroh basically saying he's going to leave. In Fortuna 4, we have Iroh leaving, and we have Fortuna left behind. This chapter deals with that theme of being left behind a lot, as well as the uncertainty of the future. This is the end of Act 1, essentially. This is all of our players are moving to their new positions on the map. And as well, Ekken's already far, far away, so he's not quite part of this, but this is the end of Act 1. And this is the beginning of Act 2. After this chapter, releases will be a bit slower, as I actually need to write the chapters rather than simply editing previous ones. But let's begin. There's a lot going on in this chapter, as per usual, and some things which we might need and use later. But as always, let's begin with the epigraph. In the late winter of that year, gleaming Calon finally closed the gates of war. With Melita slain, the Stone-Tooth dead by his own hand, and the false Kaiser ripped apart by those he had trusted, Tychon Otho remained as the sole and true emperor in Noria. As per custom, upon his return, the emperor ascended to the Tourmaline Spire, then went down to the tomb of his predecessors. It is said that he spent the entire night before the grave of Melanthius the Great, ruminating on the task now before him, how to rule well and how history might judge his works. So, this epigraph basically frames this chapter as one about history and how rulers are interpreted by the people and how new rulers have expectations of the previous to essentially live up to. And this mirrors Melanthios as this passage is about Melanthios at the end of the Tetrarchy, but this is actually about Kanta, and he's using Melanthios as proxy. The wording, however, the tomb of his predecessors is ambiguous whether this is the previous Norian emperors or this is Melanthios's ancestor. This is Tychon Otho's ancestors, because Tychon Otho actually is vaguely related to the Melanthinids, if not fully directly. And then here we also learned about the fates of our various players in the Tetrarchy, which we have heard mention of a few times. We have Melita, who is slain up atop at Tegius Hill. We have the Stone-Tooth, Sarpedon Stone-Tooth, who commits suicide, or rather exit game. And then we have the false Kaiso, where there was someone claiming to be Kaiso, but he was apparently ripped apart by a mob. So, to actually discuss the contents of this chapter is one of recollection, where Fortuna cannot sleep. They think about the previous day and the events therein, and then they have a duel in the moonlight with Sir Miles Verid. And then we have Fortuna and Miles discuss the past, the present, and the future. And then Iroh leaves. And then Fortuna wakes, and we have a plotline resolved, shall we say, but we will get to that. So before that, I actually want to say that the idea of the gates of war is actually like the gates of Janus in ancient Rome, where these gates would be opened when war began and closed when war ended, essentially. But we have Fortuna trying to embrace Shy Estelle, the goddess of sleep, and not being able to, instead being left warm and writhing, unable to sleep. And Fortuna is a perfectionist. Fortuna thinks about what they have to do, what they must do in order to make things better. And Fortuna is moving around in bed, looking at the ceiling. And this idea of 25, 26, 25 is them counting the boards. Maybe they're counting the boards on the top. Maybe it's somewhere between 25 and 26, but it's not quite right. Nothing is quite right. Things are misplaced. And then with the bird hooting in the distance, Fortuna is drifting off, remembering the past day. Or rather, no, the past day. So they are eating soup of parsnip, onion, and beef, which is the continuity of Iroh 4 and what Amnia is preparing that evening. However, immediately we have the offense that there's a high and low table compared to, say, Lucian 2, where there's one table. Here we have a clear, immediate stratification of a hierarchy in Kanta's new regime. And specifically, we hear that Fortuna is eating next to Kanta, Meg, and Sir Miles, but is nevertheless eating alone, because the people Fortuna would like to eat with, Lucian, Iroh, the members of the household guard, they aren't there. And even though Fortuna has a pre-existing relationship with Sir Miles and has as we will see, basically a father-child relationship with Sir Miles, Fortuna is in a mental state that they are alone. Loneliness, much in the idea of Lucian 3, is a prison of the mind's own making. That Fortuna, being physically in the same room with people and even sitting at the same table with people they care and respect for, well, at least Sir Miles, Fortuna is nevertheless alone. And this loneliness is something which is troubling and causes one to act out. As for the meal itself, well, they are the people at the lower table, that Tarek, Marcus, and Andreas, the three of the remaining 12 household guard, and Eli and Petrus and the rest of them, they're served the same meal, but and the specific garnishes of horseradish, nuts, and fruit, which is a little cheeky nod to something, but they're also served eggs. And the eggs, they have less per person. That the meal is the same for now, but the garnishes are not the same. They have not been given the same amount of eggs, and this is an idea of what could be to come. And Fortuna, to distract themselves, eats some horseradish and feels the burn. Sir Miles asks if they're troubled, and then we get this idea that there are three empty chairs at the high table. One's for Brother Preston, one is for Irel, and the third is, well, it's obviously for Egg in Hand, but they don't actually state it is Egg in Hand until Egg in Hand comes in, but it's very, very obviously who they're talking about in this passage is Egg in Hand, and that the day is bitter. Fortuna awoke and aching, knowing without soon mean. This is a reference to, well, you can guess what this is a reference to, but Fortuna nevertheless does their job, except falters due to the shock of seeing someone return, a rider atop a black steed, and we only know of one rider atop a black steed. In the actual story, minus that one highwayman we see in Iroh 1. So, Brother Preston is deeply upset about something, and it is quite obvious they're talking about Egg in Hand, but their Egg in Hand is not mentioned yet. But as for what Egg in Hand is looking for, well, he's going for sections from the annals, law scrolls, marriage contracts, scrolls of fables, inheritances, and the question is then, what do all these have in common? Annals are not histories. Histories are telling the events of the past as narrative. Annals are chronicles of events saying, in this month, this happened, in this month, this happened. And, or like this person was born, they lived so many years, that it's much more tabular. As for laws, marriage contracts, these all suggest things of inheritance, especially the literal inheritances. So what does heredity of possession mean, and why is Egg in Hand concerned with that? So that is a good question we might learn about later. And Fortuna, in fact, puzzles this, tries to think about this, but isn't quite sure, which is striking because Fortuna usually knows really what is on people's mind. For instance, we will learn that Fortuna immediately puts it together that Egg in Hand was the one who shot Iroh, which is correct. So Fortuna asks, where is he now? And they want Preston says that Egg in Hand wanted a ride, which is actually where Egg in Hand is meeting Iroh in Iroh 4. How Egg in Hand knew to find Iroh in the woods, well, some things might be best left unknown, or simply Egg in Hand is good and was able to predict that Iroh would be out and knew Iroh would do something like that. How in Iroh's head Egg in Hand is, well, the exact reason for that will be revealed at some future time, but generally can be summarized as Egg in Hand is good. Egg in Hand has been spying on Iroh for a very long time and knows how he thinks. So we have the wind from Iroh 4, and then we have the reveal that Egg in Hand has come back with a massive amount of luggage. We don't know where he's riding to, but where he's riding to, it will take a long time. But also suggests that he's either riding a very long time himself or intends on riding away with someone. And it's obviously Iroh and Fortune, in fact, scolds themselves later, saying, I knew he was going to be riding away with Iroh. Why didn't I think about it like that? It was so obvious, yet Fortuna was not able to admit it to themselves. So Brother Preston gets silent And then we here have the gold and black motif of Egenhand walking in, being in black, coated in gold, which makes us think of, well, something in the prologue, which in a couple chapters in the Iroh plotline, we'll eventually get more onto what that is, but that's more, say, Iroh 6, which is about 7 or 8 chapters away. So, however, Fortuna then reveals they know. They know Egenhand shot Iroh and had taken his brother away, which is Fortuna blames Egenhand for taking Lucian away. So here we have this weird web of blame. So in terms of Lucian thinks Edmund is the one who's responsible for coming to Castle Ravencroft and taking him away. Fortuna, however, does not blame Edmund for coming. Fortuna blames Egenhand for coming and taking away both Iroh and Lucian. Iroh blames Iroh blames he doesn't really blame anyone for taking Lucian away. He just sees it as something that's happening. But in terms of who shot whom, Iroh thinks it was Edmund who shot him and has sworn to kill Edmund. Lucian blames himself for shooting Iroh. Edmund blames himself for shooting Iroh, and Fortuna blames Egenhand for shooting Iroh. So they all are blaming different people. And then we have a shadow behind the shadow, if you would. Iroh steps out, being ghoul pale and dressed in white. As for ghoul pale, this is simply the pallor that the undead or corpses get. And he's dressed in white, so he looks even more like a ghost. That's Egenhand is robust and of solid color and alive, and Iroh is still, well, he actually has bandages on his head, and he's dressed in white and is pale. He looks like a mummy, essentially. And Fortuna is startled by this, jumps up and sends stew flowing over the table, which is embarrassing. And that is the one pain joining another, is the burning sensation of the hot liquid, but then also the shame of being clumsy. And Fortuna begins scribbling away, but then there's Margaret. And Margaret is the handmaid to, or was the handmaid to Lady Shoshana. That's it. She's one of the servants of the castle, one of the castle maids, if you would. However, here we learn something interesting, that more than Lucian or even Brother Preston, it was Margaret who had helped the lady through her final months, which means that Lucian, despite being concerned with deontology, despite being concerned with was justice and how people had ought to act justly, Lucian did not care for his mother as she was dying as much as he could have, and even delegated that to Brother Preston. And Brother Preston also did not do too much, that it was Margaret who was the one who actually cared for her. And this is something which, well, might weigh heavily on Lucian, might not weigh heavily on Lucian. We'll see. But she now is merely the stable master's wife, because who else is she going to marry? And now she is maid to the castle. And Margaret essentially emasculates Fortuna by taking the cloth and scrubbing it off, and Fortuna is infantilized, and Fortuna is quivering in shame and also anger and embarrassment, and someone snickered. And if someone nearby snickered, it's Meg. Let's be real here. It's Meg who snickers. And now Fortuna is enraged because Fortuna does not like Kenta, but Fortuna hates Meg, and that is something that very much comes across in this chapter. And then Kenta's an interesting thing in this chapter, where Kenta seems to be sort of jockeying for power, that Fortuna is flustered, Fortuna spills stew on themselves, Fortuna is infantilized by Margaret, and Kenta rises up and says, "Brother, please join us. Isn't this wonderful? You are up, you are alive." And it's meant to be a contrast between Fortuna and Kenta, where Kenta is poised and Fortuna is not poised, and Kenta is graceful and Fortuna is not graceful. And Kenta is the image of authority, and Fortuna is not, and makes Fortuna feel incredibly inadequate. Except is that, and then in fact, Fortuna's gaze meets Kenta's, which is that their gaze is lock, and could be like, is Kenta being like, "Oh, I'm going to be even more impressive because you are being so inadequate." But then this just kind of isn't actually what's going on. That if you look at this from an unbiased perspective, Kenta rises, says, I'm glad you're alive. Please have dinner with us." And this is a very normal thing to do. Just Kenta doesn't have a lot of emotion in her voice. And And then in fact, the guards then sure they're like doing Cantus beck and call, saying we salute you, Lord Irol, but like they're the household guard. That's what they're meant to do. So nothing's going wrong here, but this is framed as like some kind of victory of Canta over Fortuna when it's not actually what's going on. It's all in Fortuna's head. And then Fortuna is incredibly embarrassed with the whole Fortuna's nervous tick of clenching their hand really, really hard. And then Iril says, "Yeah, no, bring our meals up to the library," which apparently, if whatever thing Egenham was looking for, he's asked Iril to look for it, and Iril is going to look for it. And then to continue with that, everyone bowed, and Iril reveals, "Yeah, I'm not gonna be Lord Iril," with Lord being the title of who, Lord Lady being the title of both who's the official head of the Murulai, but also who is the current head of Castle Ravencroft. You'll forgive the bell in the background. And then we have this one of the few similes that or metaphors that Fortuna uses, which is that it was as glass or rotted steel, which is rusted steel shattering inside Fortuna's mind, which is incredibly painful. Fortuna clenches harder and feeling the tendons pull against bone. And Meg teases Fortuna because Meg is we don't like Meg. Out of our massive cast of morally great characters and people are trying their best, Meg is one of the few characters who seems to be actually just a bad person. But Kenta then breaks the silence and says, "When will you leave?" And Egenhan, not Iril, but Egenhan responds that Iril truly has been ceding an immense amount of authority to Egenhan, and this is actually because, in Iril 4, Egenhan says, you work for me now. That's the way things are going to be. And Fortuna then the memory breaks. Fortuna rises to say something, but doesn't say anything and sits back down. And then the memory breaks. And here we have Fortuna curse themselves. The memory is over, having not known what to say, how they wish they could have gone down Deckard and denounced him for what he was in front of them all. And this is the part of the chapter where Fortuna does something we all do, which is Fortuna goes over the arguments they would have said at the time and is constructing art and winning arguments in their head against a figment of their imagination if against this version of Egghead that exists in their mind, and it's very funny. But they say, "No, you did. You shot eye roll," and of course, Egghead would then say that there was ridiculous. They had no proof, and then Fortuna is giving in Fortuna's mind is giving bangers against Egghead, but like enjoy hinting at things to come. What does this mean? Well, like Fortuna essentially is constructing an idea in their head where they are rhetorically beating Egenhand into the ground, when realistically this isn't what Egenhand would actually say. As for the idea of the gods having a sense of humor or enjoy hinting at things to come, this is more or less a joke about the creative process entirely. So Fortuna Fortuna imagines Egenhand didn't answer their questions, but Fortuna could have just imagined Egenhand answering the question, but doesn't. And then does admit it. Sarah wasn't meant for any other. But the fact is, Fortuna does not know why exactly. Like, why couldn't Egenhand just have told Iril to come and said it's a much better idea? Why did Egenhand why really did Egenhand devise this random ass scheme of telling Iril to go with him and then shooting Iril and then creating a hunting trip, but it wasn't Egenhand who created the hunting trip, it was Edmund who suggested they go hunting. So and then Egenhand uses the opportunity to shoot Iril. So it's like, what was Egenhand thinking? Was he gonna sneak into Iril's bedchamber and put something through his eye or chop off some of his fingers or something? Like, why this incredibly why did Egenhand insist on this incredibly just random series of events that seemingly he wasn't in control of, all just to actually make Iroh go with him, which was something Egenhand was planning on intentionally? What, why? And this is something that Fortuna can't answer. And then they think on the arguments, but because they still don't know the answer. The arguments blood together, and Fortuna is back in bed. 25, 26, 20, and 5. Fortuna gets up and starts pacing around and is getting nowhere. But turns out Sir Miles is also up because just as Fortuna is up in the middle of the night with their upsets, Sir Miles is up in the middle of the night with his upsets. That we will learn more about Sir Miles in the pages to come. But he says, I basically recognize your steps, young person. And this this section of the chapter is very much very Dune in that like it's if you've read if you've read the first book of Dune, you'll remember how there's like the chapter with Paul and Yue, the chapter in Paul and his father, the chapter in Paul and Jessica, the chapter of Paul and Gurney Halleck, the chapter of Paul and Thufir Hawat, and so on. And this is very much like this is the duel between the master and the apprentice. And Fortuna cannot sneak up on Sir Miles. And we learn that Sir Miles is of the previous generation, that he is of the generation of Fortuna's father, which and also therefore Casimir's that he's the generation of Casimir, but not quite actually. He's older than the Marulai's father, but younger than the grandfather. So he's in the intermediate point. He is 60 and he is incredibly scarred and messed up as a person, but he's this big gray bear of a man who's still strong. But the fact that he's a master at arms at 60 really suggests that the Marulai were not terribly engaged with the martial prowess of the children is not something that they would care too much about, or that rather Sir Miles is someone who is incredibly loyal to the Marulai as we learn, and it is not that the Casimir Marula is more concerned with having someone loyal in the position than having someone who's like young and incredibly fit in the position. Sure, Sir Miles is fit. He is a competent fighter. So this all puts together this idea that Sir Miles is not only values the Marulai highly, but he is valued by the Marulai highly, and also the Marulai, considering themselves essentially a tier 3 great clan, are not terribly concerned with certain matters of like having a young master at arms. So Fortuna throws Fortuna is here looking for a fight, throwing Sir Miles' words back at him, and Sir Miles offers to duel. And Fortuna gets in this nice blunt sword that's poorly weighted and warms up by striking a series of lashes against the wicker soldier. But then Sir Miles reveals, no, actually, by when I said the hours later than you think, I meant that it's like going to be dawn in an hour or two. And Fortuna is like, oh, I've been up the whole night and didn't get any sleep. Fuck. And Fortuna, being a perfectionist, is rather upset about this. And then Fortuna threatens Sir Miles, but they calm down and they fight. Sure thing, old man. And then here we do the thing where we have two characters fighting, and they're also having a conversation as they fight, and the tempo of the conversation or the argument mirrors the tempo of the fight, which is nice little literary cliche I like. And that is how this entire passage is structured. But we have Fortuna starting with eye roll, but Fortuna is not actually concerned with eye roll. Fortuna is concerned with Canta. And we have Fortuna is presenting this idea that they blame Iroh for taking Lucian away when we know that's not true. We know Fortuna blames Egg in Hand, and then Miles quickly picks up on this idea that Fortuna is not being forthcoming with what they're actually upset about. But Fortuna does nevertheless blame themselves. And Miles is doing the good old Socratic thing of just asking why over and over and over. In fact, Fortuna says that we continue our work like the work of promoting justice in Ardonia, and then Fortuna says, you know, as in like Fortuna can't quite articulate what was the whole thing they were doing. There's this idea of not taking bribes and making sure people get what they need, and you get like the example of the lavender farmer, but this question of like what is actually promoting justice, what is making sure everyone has what they need. This is a broader systemic question which Fortuna is struggling to answer in the moment. Justice is, after all, a hard thing, and one of the Platonic dialogues is solely devoted to this idea of what is justice. So Miles asks why, and then Fortuna says basically Lucian's gone. Because Lucian's gone, Kent is in charge. Because Lucian and Iroh are going to be gone, Kent will be in charge, and then I won't be able to do what I want because Kenta isn't going to listen to me. Kenta is going to listen to Meg. But is that true? Not entirely. Kenta we know from Iroh 4, thinks very highly of Fortuna and surely would listen to Fortuna's judgments, and that it wouldn't just be Meg forcing out Fortuna um, to take their place, but actually we have that Kanta would likely listen to Meg and listen to Fortuna. Of course, Fortuna wants Kanta to listen only to them, or rather, Fortuna would rather none of this had happened and Lucian still be here. And Fortuna basically is mad that Lucian's gone and says, okay, if Lucian was gone, Iroh, we could have dealt with that. But Iroh's gone too, so now we're stuck with Kanta. And this is Miles says, yeah, you blame yourself for his injury, which is not really true, but is kind of true. That Fortuna, in the active mind, thinks it was Eganhan who shot Iroh, and thinks Eganhan was the one who followed Iroh to Erdonia to specifically recruit him and shot him as part of this whole scheme. But in Fortuna 1, Iroh reveals that he only came back to Erdonia specifically because he didn't want to be part of the Rooks and thought he could possibly pursue a future with Fortuna. Were Fortuna not at Castle Ravencroft, were Fortuna not in Erdonia, Iroh might not have come back, and if Iroh might not have come back, then Eganhan wouldn't have followed Iroh, and then Eganhan would have shot Iroh. So in some roundabout way, Fortuna does have some kind of role in this whole thing, but not really. That Fortuna could be considered a reason Iroh was back at Castle Ravencroft, but that is completely independent of Eganhan and Eganhan's scheming. And Fortuna insults Sir Miles, calling me an old goat instead of an old bear. And Sir Miles says, for the god of war, there's only custom, or rather, which is an extension of the saying that for the gods, there is only custom. Or in other words, laws don't exist for the gods, or rather, laws exist for humans, but not for gods, which means if one considers oneself a god, then there are no laws, everything is permitted. Um, as for victory or death, but specifically for the god of war, there's only custom. This means there is no law on the field of battle. You win or you die, victory or death. And then for those who hesitate of law, so essentially on the battlefield, it is win or die because hesitation is defeat, and you are hesitating because your mind's elsewhere. Hesitation is defeat. And Fortuna gets up, and then Miles cuts to the heart of the matter. What is really bothering you? And their blade is half black and half polished. And of course, we only know one thing that's black and polished in the story so far, which is Iroh's necklace, or rather, Lucian's necklace, because Iroh doesn't have it anymore. And this is something that is bothering This is something that is bothering Fortuna because where did it come from? It wasn't why was Iroh hiding it all this time? What does it do? What does it mean that Lucian has it now? And is it related to Is it related to any of this? And it's something weird. It's something inexplicable. But there's also a question of that is Iroh. Well, Iroh's gotten up. He's clearly not lost his mind, but he's also like not himself. Something's changed. Do I tell him? But Fortuna then says it's Kanta, which is actually what the matter is, because Fortuna is afraid of not being able to realize their goals. And an Iroh who's not Iroh would be just as detrimental to that as Kanta, except Kanta's the actual situation. That the amulet Iroh has is simply emblematic of this, is emblematic of snacks in the system, flies in the ointment. What is the trick? So it's Kanta. What about her? And I fear her judgment. And then Sprouse asks, why? Again. And Fortuna can't explain it, but just says, Kanta's different, and Kanta won't do what I want, especially not with Meg. And then Miles keeps on asking why, and then Kanta freaks out and just smashes their blade into Miles's blade, knocks him to the ground, and just starts hammering down on him in just sheer rage. And then Fortuna hits Miles, which is, I really hope that didn't cause any internal bleeding. And then basically Fortuna is arguing that Kanta has a different moral system, that Kanta will not have the same goals that Fortuna and Lucian had. And Miles says, I think you're tending the sheep only for its wool, which is that you can raise a sheep for wool. You can also raise a sheep for breeding. You can also raise a sheep for meat, or all three. So by tending the sheep only for its wool essentially means you are looking at only one of the possible things that you can get out of the scenario, with that one possible scenario, that one possible outcome being Kanta is bad for Edonia, with the other possible outcomes being Kanta will be all right or beneficial. And then Miles continues with this rather eloquent metaphor for Miles, because Miles is someone who is rather rough spoken for this entire chapter, and someone who uses like is not his speech is not as polished as say Lucian or Ekans. He says Kanta is that like there's like how a bunch of kittens in a litter can have like all have pelts that are similar to their parents. That um uh, Kanta is the sibling of Iroh and Lucian, and that they are all raised together, and that they therefore all have like similar beliefs, which is true. They all have different ideas of what justice is. Lucian is like, everyone gets what they need, and Iroh is um uh, justice is cosmic balance, and Kant is like justice is safety and security, which are all similar but all have different outcomes ultimately. And then Miles says it more specifically. Kanta is Casimir's daughter, as much as Iroh and Lucian are his sons. And then, however, Kanta has more of an eye for order. And then he's thinking of like the amount of time Kanta spends with Meg, that when they were children is all about order, but also because of the amount of time Kanta spends with Meg and the amount of time that Meg spends with Miles, her father, then therefore sort of in a way kind of Kanta is Miles' child, which is like Miles therefore has a third parent to Kanta as well as Shoshana and Casimir, which is interesting because the idea of third parents is not something we really think about. But like this would be a third parent in the fictive sense, but maybe in like a more literal sense that if you have, say, a cultural belief that there's the mother and their father, but then there's like a second father who also has some kind of genetic impact on the kid, then that kid has three children. That kid has three parents. But Sir Miles then cuts the heart of the matter again and says, do not underestimate Kanta, and then also do not underestimate me. That I also have more abilities than you are thinking of. I also have more things going on. There is also there are hidden things inside of many people, me myself included. And then Fortuna says, it is not her abilities that concern me, but her words, which is, I do not fear her innate abilities. I fear what she does with those innate abilities. I fear the words. Words are things that have power over people, and that she will listen to Meg more than me, and I fear Adonia will be worse for it. Very spelling it out. And then Miles admits that Meg, presumably, has gotten away from me, that Meg is not the daughter Miles wished she had had, but it's not the place to challenge the gods, which is we think he's talking about Meg, but he could be talking about Kenta because he did just immediately say that he considers Kenta his kid in some respect. But then this would read that Kenta has gotten away from Miles, and that Kenta is not the daughter he wished he had, but it's not his place to challenge the gods. Like this idea that either the gods how they made Kenta in this sort of like fate kind of sense, or maybe like the fate that Kenta is not actually Miles' child or something like that, in a metaphorical sense, if you would. And then Fortune says, okay, would you stand by Kanta even if she errs by your daughter's judgment? And Miles stands his ground, both figuratively and literally. He says, I serve Castle Ravencroft, and whoever rules it. And Fortuna does not like that. And then Miles returns to the metaphor of the kittens. They're different, but all still kin. Though sure, Lucian and Iroh are both Casimir's sons, Kanta's Casimir's daughter. Lucian is more Casimir's son than the rest. And then Fortuna takes the metaphor of this whole metaphor about kittens and pelts and heredity and flips it on their head, because actually there's this term, the exact name of the term is escaping me, but essentially is that littermates, because they're essentially the animal equivalent of fraternal twins, littermates don't need to have the same father, and that you can have different cats or dogs in a litter that have different pelts because they literally have different fathers. So this is saying that that Miles is saying, "Oh yes, they're all sure they're like they're litter mates, so they're similar, but they're also different, but they're also like all the same because they're raised together and they all have the same mom and things like that." And Kent is like, "Yeah, but what if they actually are just fundamentally different?" And Sir Miles does, well, something we haven't seen yet in the story, which is presenting a metaphor. Someone po pokes a hole in the metaphor and says, okay, maybe it's a bad metaphor, which is not something you see very often in like Socratic dialogues or things like that. So he says, yeah, maybe it's a bad metaphor. But like what I'm essentially saying is that Iroh and Kanta are the same. That look at with this so with this look, it's that Iroh and Kanta are they're all siblings. That yeah, you probably would have had a problem with eye roll too, as well as Kenta. But everything that's good in them, because that if Lucian is Casimir's son more than the others, Iroh and Kenta are Shoshana's children more than the others. That Casimir takes after that Lucian takes after the father, Iroh and Kenta take after the mother, and specifically they take after their mother. But Shoshana herself took after her own mother, Iroh and Kanta's maternal grandmother, Samira Argent. And then Fortuna's like, okay, how long have you been here? Who are you talking about? I don't know this person. And then Sprout says, it gets another point and says, I've been here long enough. And Fortuna says, you speak of the dead as they're still here. Where did the dead go? And Miles says, gloomy eyed, they are still here. I remember them. That people still exist so long as we remember them. And I still see, and he says I still see them in my dreams, which is powerful. But also in his dreams, he's young again, which is. Uh, but he specifically has the memory of when he first arrived at Castle Ravencroft on the brink of death, and um that he was nursed back to health by Lady Samira, Iroh and Candace's maternal grandmother, and that the same spirit that was in her, which is the same spirit which is then like everything that is good in Iroh and Kenta, that everything is good in Iroh and Kenta is actually Lady Samira, which went down through Shoshana to into um uh, Iroh and Kenta. That the same this essence transferred to them, and this essence is also everything that's good in them, and this spirit that's shown in them, this light, this gleaming, and then seeing Kenta, it's like Sammy's come again. And this is weird. So now we have at this point several different metaphors of like families stacked on top of one another. But we'll get to that. We'll elaborate on that in a little bit. So Fortuna says Sammy, and then he's like, oh, it's a nickname. What? I think it's about time we unpack all these metaphors. So with this idea that, okay, the way this idea that yes, the three siblings, Lucian, Iroh, and Kent are all siblings, and they're all Shoshana's child, and they're all Casimir's child. But Kenta is kind of and Kenta and Meg kind of like Miles's daughters, but Kenta's actually Casimir's daughter. So it's like that's a mess of heredity. But then Kenta and Iroh are Samira's granddaughters, but also Kenta is like a reincarnation of Samira, and Miles clearly had some kind of affinity for Samira. So then if Kanta is Miles' daughter, metaphorically speaking, and then Kanta is Samira, this person Miles had an affinity, who in fact Fortunus says, you loved her, didn't you? And Miles says, I couldn't. So like, sure, maybe. Then is Kanta the reincarnation of Miles's if is Kenta the reincarnation of Miles's crush, or is Kenta the metaphorical child of Miles and his crush? But not actually his crush, or with the mother being Shoshana and the father being Casimir, and Miles with Kanta being the metaphorical child and metaphorical reincarnation of Samira. So it's this tangled web of like metaphor and heredity, in that Kanta is Samira, but Kanta is Shoshana, but Iroh is Samira in some regards too. But this idea that Kanta is simultaneously the child of her grandmother. Kenta is the child of her mother and her father, literally speaking, but Kenta is also the child of her grandmother and this other person who is metaphorically her father because she spent a lot of time with him growing up. but also Kanta is then metaphorically like the reincarnation of the person who is her own grandmother. It's weird. It is can't. It's this really weird web, and then on top of this entire web of everything, Miles calls Samira Sammy. And we've only heard Sammy one else other place. He says it was a nickname called between me, Amnia, Castor, Melissa, and Old Charcoal Hand, who is Iril Argent, Iril's maternal grandfather, Candace's maternal grandfather. And he hasn't heard the name in years. So, with all that in mind, how the hell did Iril know about the nickname? And if he says Sammy and Castor is the paternal grandfather. Sammy is the maternal grandmother, with Melissa being the paternal grandmother and Charcoalhand being the maternal grandfather. So, how did Iril know about the name? In fact, Fortuna picks up on this, but isn't quite able to vocalize it. Like, how does Iril know about the nickname? How did he learn about it? We know Lucian learned about it because he had like read it somewhere because it was written down somewhere. But Iril didn't spend all of his time with his nose poked in books and things like that. Unlike Lucian, who like we know spent a lot of time reading over histories and books of law and things like that. In fact, the same materials that Egenhand is currently trying to go through are the types of materials that Lucian would go through in his spare time, as we know from like Lucian 1. So Lucian learned about the nickname that way, but how did Iril learn about it? And then that Sammy dying young is supposed to mirror the Ekin's like stepmother, the first the first wife of Eckhart Helster. It's supposed to mirror that, but the rest of them are just left behind. The living are left here. And then he says, I couldn't love her, but she's the reason I'm here. That I serve the Mirror until the scales are balanced, which is like until I die, essentially. And then Fortuna says, okay, well then why have you tolerated me? Don't tell me you also consider me one of your kids, essentially. Then that Miles has 3 children, Fortuna, Meg, and Kenta, metaphorically speaking. And then Miles says, kinda, yeah. That Fortuna, Whisker, Detty, and whatever. You're as much Lady Shoshana's child as the rest. That Fortuna is one of the brood. That of this generation with Lucian and Iril and Kanta and kind of Edmund and kind of Meg and then also Fortuna, that they're all like one family together because they are all raised together in some at some point or another. And that Fortuna is that if metaphorically speaking, Kanta is Miles' son, that's if Kant is Miles' daughter. Metaphorically speaking as well, Fortuna is Shoshana's daughter. Sure, not daughter, but well, it's Fortuna's child. Is Shoshana's child. It's this weird. It's weird, but Fortuna has Shoshana's voice. But if but is that Samira's voice? That is Fortuna also have Samira's voice? If Shoshana's voice was Samira's voice, then with the whole transferring between generations, does Fortuna have Samira's voice, which is the voice of the person Miles was at least infatuated with, maybe on a romantic level, but on like a affinity level. And Fortuna says, I'm touched. Thank you, Miles. I really needed that. But Miles is now upset because he's thinking about the dead. And then we've already said too much. Leave a man his secrets. Was a man without his secrets. Was a man but a pile of secrets. And Fortuna thinks a man, sure, but what about me? What about a Detian? That this is the beginning of perhaps Fortuna questioning their gender role, their role in society. What do they want to do? And what's going on with all this? And Fortuna has a lot on their mind. Says, promise me something. If you have concerns, we share them with you, which is basically one step below. If you don't like what Kant is doing, will you stand with me? And they say someone's coming, and it's Iril. And Iril and Egenhand leave, and then we have this reveal that where Egenhand looks back, or we don't actually know it's Egenhand until the end of the chapter, until the end of the paragraph. And Vera being the goddess of like things made by humans, like god of like military excellence and god of crafts and things like that, and then like blacksmithing, weaving, and baking, and all things made by people. Iril, what have you done? And he's leaving, running away. And Iroh left without ever saying goodbye, and it's stressed. And the Fortuna thinks, yeah, Brother Preston thought Eigenhand's like some shape changing assassin or something, but Fortuna thinks Iroh is one of that Eigenhand is one of the High Ordinators, which is the head of the Inquisition. And here we have some lore about the Inquisition. But this is an interesting thing where first off, Egenhand says you must divest everything of you, which means you must remove yourself from everything rather than divest yourself of everything, which means you must remove everything out of you. Iroh must become isolated, not because he is having things taken away from him, but because he's taking himself away from everything, which is Fortuna actually gets the wording wrong, noticeably. But from this description, we learn that the people say the Inquisition is this incredibly powerful, prevalent organization. But then when we actually hear from Egenhand in Iroh 4, he says he lists the Inquisitions with a bunch of organizations he thinks are inadequate and that he thinks he's better than. So is the Inquisition actually what people say it is? We don't know. We will learn more about this later. But based off this description, maybe it's actually that the Inquisition only has a couple hundred people. Maybe they don't actually have thousands of informants. Maybe it's just them. And maybe being an organization that's a monastic order and only has a couple hundred people, maybe their influence really is just limited to fair play and the rest is just hype. We don't know. We'll see. So, Sorrels looks at Fortune, just like, what are you talking about? And then Iroh leaves through the opened gate. And then Fortuna goes gets some rest, and then comes in, and then we have Kenta and Meg all in Great Hall because Fortuna overslept. They had not slept at all before finding Shai still in their bed, open armed. But here we have the Kenta is perched atop the Murlai's throne, which is pretty sinister, and the other at her left. But left is interesting because the legate stands at the right of the Lord. The left is usually reserved for like the wife of the Lord or something like that. So Meg is sure there next to Kanta, but Kanta has reserved a spot next to her throne for Fortuna. And this goes over Fortuna's head again. So this is a question of like what part of Fortuna's anticipations about Kanta are just in their head and what part are real. And then we also have this idea about the old man at the mountain, which we'll learn about more later. But Fortuna says Iroh's gone, and Kenta just says we know. But like this could be Fortuna reads this as Kenta just brushing Fortuna off, but Kenta is always speaking in this like monotone, disinterested voice. But this is also wordplay. Disinterested could mean like aloof and uncaring, but disinterested could also mean impartial. So again, this idea is Kenta actually as bad as exists in Fortuna's mind? And this is also very neutral. Just come here, please come here. We have a lot of work to do. Is not threatening at all. And then the first petitioner arrives, and it is Martinez. He's back on the day. He's back on the fourth day. Um, yes, he's back on the fourth day with the first day being the day he's released, which is the day of the hunting accident. Day two. What the? Yeah. Day two being the day that Iroh wait that day two being the day Lucian leaves, day three being the day Iroh wakes up, which is the current day, was the day the chapter begins in, and the day four is um the day beyond, which is actually day five of the overall plot, and they were doing a plot line. So he's back on the fourth day to receive the lashes. Except here is the dramatic irony. Lucian confessed to Iroh in Iroh 3 that he only intended on giving one lash. But Lucian is not here. He did not tell Kenta, and we know from context clues that Lucian did not do corporal punishment generally when he was doing things. So we actually don't know how many lashes. Kenta does not know exactly how many lashes Lucian planned on giving. That Kenta could possibly have inferred that Lucian was only going to give one, and perhaps thought that Lucian should have given more. That Lucian wasn't doing enough to like incite fear into the people of Fredonia, or maybe Candace just ends up doing as many lashes as she thinks she had ought to. But she says, I will give punishment as I see fit, so maybe the latter. And then they go down to Castle Ravencroft's village, and they go up onto a scaffolding which is meant for sacrifices, which is also could be like possibly like a bull sacrifice or something like that for a festival day, or it could be a execution, which is a sacrifice of sorts. And he's forced to his knees, which makes us think of beheading. And then the Meg's voice is first a waver because this is the first time Meg's doing this. They are also unsure of things. And then they rile up the crowd, and the crowd is going wild, and Fortuna's like, is this we did all this work, but did it actually matter? Or is this just the natural state of things? That this is a role they've known how to play for a while, and they got to play a different role while we were in charge, but now they're going back to the role they're used to. We don't know. And they stand stone-faced, clenching their hand. And then he says, uh, Neg says, he shall receive penalty so that he will never hurt anyone ever again, which really makes us think of execution, but this is not execution. This is the nout, which is the lashes. But to make then to make it think like this could be turned into an execution. And then we have at least 4 lashes given that Kent, however, also does not peel off Martinez's clothing, which means that whatever Martinez is wearing is going to get ruined as part of the punishment. And then crack, 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 Fortuna stands, unable to look away, which mirrors the beginning of the chapter, crack, and then the lashes continue. This is the thing that inaugurates in Canta's reign as Lady of Erdonia. It is a public, humiliating punishment of someone who confessed arson. Maybe actually this could be either just Kanta doing what she thinks she ought to, or maybe this really is the beginning of the worst timeline. We'll see in the future. And with this question of like, what is justice and what is Kanta and Fortuna, what are they going to do? Well, that is where we leave this chapter. And next time we are going at Lucian 4, which is the entrance of Fair Calais, long awaited. I look forward to seeing you all there. Bye.